Okay, guys, we're going to do a chapter 2. We're going to do the history of the Constitution and the ratification process before, and then we'll do another video on amendments and clauses. But we're going to get these 2 videos done tonight for sure, maybe a third one if I can, and deploy them tonight. Anyway, okay, chapter 2 of your study guide on page 13. We're also, at the end of all this, we're going to talk about all the states over the whole course of the semester, all the different states that apply. In your red finals packet, about midway through, you have 30 questions on lecture, the obscure stuff, or states. A lot of that stuff will come into play. Those are fairly easy questions just to jog your memory. You may only have 1 or 2 that are like that on the exam, but nevertheless, you can look them over. All right. So we don't need to go over any of the very beginning of chapter 2 other than the fact that we have to establish a federalist system. Federalist system divides power between the national and state governments. Anything not specially given to the federal government and is limited to the federal government, national government, shall be reserved to the states. That's under the 10th Amendment. Reserved non-national powers to the states or individuals. But one thing the Constitution does is it limits the power of the national government. Now we're going to see in a series of cases when we talk about the clauses and amendments, you're going to see a bunch of cases that give more power to the national government. But remember, the Constitution as a document limits the power of the regulation of the federal government, but it also gives the national government the power to regulate business activity. All right. When we talk about the history and the ratification process, you really need to know a bunch of little things, but you need to know the cause and effect. What did each of these events do? What was a precursor to it? What was the aftermath of it? And if you want to make a list, a chart where whatever event we talk about, you can put the cause on one side, the effect on the other, by listening to the video a couple of times, because I'm going to go over it in depth. All right. So if you look over, you have the colonists were loyal British citizens for years and years and years. They had their system set up through the House of Burgesses that worked for a long time. Then we had the weakening of that system and the weakening of their loyalty due to the French and Indian War. It was very expensive to the national government of Britain, and they were going to make the colonists pay for the French and Indian War that was on their soil with a series of taxes. Now, these series of taxes, as felt this was unfair, at least without representation, but in general unfair as well. Okay, the series of taxes that were done began to force the colonists to pay for the war. The cause of it was to pay off the debt associated to the French and Indian War. The effect on all these series of taxes provides the colonists with an idea that this is unfair, loyalty is dissipated, and stuff like that, and they move towards independence. Okay, the first tax is the Sugar Act of 1764. Sugar, wine, coffee. Now, sugar would be too easy, but if he says wine, coffee, that's under the series of taxes dealing with the Sugar Act. Now, there is one question that has been told to me that's kind of a frustrating question to many. Which of the following occurred after the French and Indian War? It didn't say directly after, it didn't say anything like that. And all of these acts, all these taxes and all these series of taxes occurred after the French and Indian War, but the first one would be the Sugar Act. So if you don't have an all of the above that works, and all of the above is an answer, you probably want to go with Sugar Act. Okay? Then you have the Stamp Act of 1765 that taxed all paper goods, pamphlets, newspapers, and stuff like that would be in there. Although not a tax, the Quartering Act regarding colonists had to quarter soldiers in their homes at their own expense. The colonists weren't getting paid by the British government to do so. All of this led to harsh feelings in New England. The Sons of Liberty organized violent protests, threatened to tax the agents associated to the British government when they were trying to collect the taxes. And this led to the first of many steps towards eventual independence. Okay? Now, on the top of page 15 of your study guide, you have the Stamp Act Congress of 1765. Where did this meet? In New York City specifically. And a majority of the colonies, not all of them, but a majority, 9 of the 13 colonies met. And what was the reason why? Because they wanted to react to all the series of taxes, mainly the Stamp Act as well, but they wanted to meet to see and draft a list of violations as to why their fundamental rights were being violated by the British Empire. Okay? As a result of this, 2 things occurred. A more unified togetherness of all the colonies, because they came and met together. And the British response to this Stamp Act Congress was a series of more taxes. Now, one of the taxes being the Townshend Act. Townshend starts with a T. It was a harsher tax and included taxes on tea. As a response to that, the cause of it, the effect of it was the colonists responded by boycotting tea, one of the major things that was brought over and imported into the colonies. The Boston Massacre, unruly colonist mob, British soldiers were taunting them, snowballs were thrown at the troops, you know it, during the wintertime. British opened fire, killing 5 colonists. Responding to the British massacre, Britain lifted mainly a lot of taxes, but not the tax on tea. Now, the main next one that you have on the exam, you have Townshend Act and the Tea Act. Both start with a T, dealing with tea. But the Townshend Act, the Tea Act, was a British response to the Committees of Correspondence in 1772. So, what was the Committees of Correspondence created? Its purpose primarily was to keep other colonists informed as to what the British soldiers, British activities were doing. And as a result, it became a very powerful tool to mold the colonists' minds against the British government. As a result of this, we had the British response to the Committees of Correspondence was the Tea Act was enacted. So we have another tax on tea along with the Townshend Act. This led to the Boston Tea Party as well. Now, the response to the Boston Tea Party was the coercive acts, also known as the intolerable acts. If you use this coercive acts, you're looking at it from the standpoint of King George. If you're looking at it from the intolerable acts, it's the same thing, but you're mainly looking at it from the viewpoint of the colonists. In these coercive acts, there were more taxes, a naval blockade, more troops were sent over to Boston, Boston being a major hub. And this response to this was to form the First Continental Congress. Now, the First Continental Congress occurred in Philadelphia. Purpose was to discuss on how they were going to be able to deal with future relations with the mother country and the British government. It resulted in more unity of the colonies, very simply, kind of like the Stamp Act Congress did, kind of like the Committees of Correspondence did, all making more and more uniform. They tried to ask for more peace and stuff like that. The king rejected their demands. As a result, you pretty much had an inevitable war for independence. Then you had the Revolutionary War that began April 19, 1775. Lexington and Concord, technically Lexington was first, Concord later on. Those are now suburbs of what we call Boston now. Shots heard around the world, first Lexington, then Concord. There's been a question, and I don't know why he did it. I don't know what reason, but Lexington is the answer, not Lexington and Concord. Either it's misbubbled or he's just trying to be, really detailed, but Lexington was the first, then Concord, because they're like 8 miles apart. After the Revolution, after the shot herds around the world, we had the Second Continental Congress. They also met in Philadelphia as well. Asked King to end the hostilities. The response by the British monarchy was to send more troops into Boston and label all delegates to the Second Continental Congress as traitors, subject to death. Okay, you had common sense. Then you had Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence signed July 4th. The Declaration of Independence was passed, then the war actually began. Theoretically, the war really began then. Declaration of Independence, mainly the author is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson being an anti-federalist in nature, just so you know, the father of the Constitution. James Madison, much more of a federalist in nature. Okay, so the actual war lasted years. Colonists had no army or navy. They were going up against the best army navy in the world at an 8-to-1 ratio in terms of troops. Long, bitter war in which independence was finally won. As a result of independence being won, we established a Confederate form of government. Confederate form of government is just basically where the states are on their own to do whatever they do. They just act as a confederacy, a grouping of them, but it led to a weak central government with no ability to tax. So therefore, the states dominated over that of the federal government. The federal government was a very small thing with nothing to do, no army, no navy, no central government, nothing really. States were treating each other hostilely, barriers to trade were existing between states, and the larger states would dominate over that of the smaller states, and that's just the bully system that we grew up with. The bigger kids beat up on the smaller kids, okay? And since the national government had no real power to tax and or have an army, navy, or anything like that. Basically, it was under the jurisdiction of each state to do what they wanted, and they decided to enact trade barriers. This is known as the chaotic period under the Articles of Confederation. Many people think that we started with a federalist form of government right after we won independence. No, we started with a Confederate form of government in which there was no president. Because one of the questions he's had that is tricky is George Washington, as the first president of the United States, led a government involved in a Confederate form of government, unitary monarch, and all that stuff. It's a federalist form of government because we had no president during the Articles of Confederation. During this chaotic period, and you might have that on the exam as well, you had Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shay, a Massachusetts farmer, had been hit hard by the economy, where foreclosures of farmland and ranches and farms are being done by the banks. Shay led farmers to stop foreclosures by using force. A large amount, they raided a federal arsenal for guns, so it was a military type thing. Use of weapons to stop foreclosures from occurring. There was no state that wanted to try it, would not do it. There's no national government that could stop them. It was a privately paid militia force. It did have some state involvement, but not much. Okay. Then we had another thing where we had the Annapolis Convention. Most every convention occurred in Philadelphia. We had the Stamp Act Congress that met in New York City. And then we had in Annapolis, Maryland, we had another convention. Now, this convention failed miserably. Not even a majority of states. I think only 5 of the 13 colonies even showed up, only a few economic leaders. They realized, though, even though there was a massive failure, it did lead to one thing, that they knew they needed to have another meeting. And that meeting led to having another one in Philadelphia, i.e. the Constitutional Convention that occurred in May of 1787. So, quite a few years after we declared and then won independence. But that was under a Confederate form of government up until then. The next thing you have is the Constitutional Convention. And if you look at it, you have 55 representatives from 12 of the states, 12 of the colonies at the time, states later on. Rhode Island did not attend. So of the 13 states that we have, Rhode Island did not attend. These are the founding fathers who were young, highly educated, wealthy. Majority of them were slave owners, although some were getting away from it. The urban areas were getting away from it because they were less agricultural than the southern states. They had various different beliefs, but they were all young, highly educated, wealthy people. And eventually they understood that even though they had to look out for their own state interests, they realized that for this to work, for this system of government to work, they had to let some of the states' rights go in order to have more of a national government. Okay. Now, the big states versus small states was pretty much one of the big things. And then you had the slave states versus the non-slave states. Those were the two fundamental issues. In terms of the big states versus small states, we had what we call the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, the Connecticut Compromise, Great Compromise, the Three-Fifths Compromise that you need to go. First of all, what did the Virginia Plan want? The Virginia Plan was for larger states. Larger states wanted to have a bicameral legislature, two House legislature, House of Representatives and the Senate, which is what we have now. But both of the House and the Senate was going to be based upon population. Therefore, the larger states like Pennsylvania, New York, Virginia, even Massachusetts, the larger states would dominate over that of the smaller states because it would be based upon population in both houses. The New Jersey Plan wanted a unicameral legislature, one House legislature in which each state was equally represented, similar to the Articles of Confederation, simply one House, one vote, and stuff like that. We eventually went to the Connecticut or Great Compromise. Connecticut or Great Compromise called for a bicameral legislature in which the upper level was equal representation, i.e. the U.S. Senate. And then the House of Representatives was going to be based upon population-based, electoral college population-based and stuff like that. So we had a bicameral legislature similar to the Virginia Plan, but we modified the New Jersey Plan for the upper level House and the Virginia Plan portion for the lower level House. Okay. The national government would then have power over the state governments in terms of all that stuff. The slavery issue, no compromise was done on slavery. Northern states wanted it abolished. South no way would agree, so there was never a way for them to get the Constitution ratified if they continued on. So they just let it out to be later discussed with like the Missouri Compromise and stuff like that. The last thing we need to talk about is the 3/5 compromise. In terms of the 3/5 compromise, okay, this was how you were going to determine what a slave would enact for not only taxation but representation. If you're going to use representation in the lower house, in the Connecticut Compromise in the lower house population, then do slaves count towards that population total? Well, South Carolina wanted the states to count for population. The North objected. The North said, okay, we're going to treat them as slaves and property, then they're not a person. They finally agreed to treat the slaves as 3/4 of a person in terms of taxation and representation. Okay? So if he asks you about the 3/5 compromise, what does it affect? It affects the lower house of a bicameral legislature in the Connecticut Compromise. It doesn't affect the upper house because each state, regardless of number of slaves, 3/5 or whatever, would have still 2 representatives from each state. So it affected the lower house in a bicameral legislature under the Great or Connecticut Compromise. It also established an executive branch, and they realized that they wanted to have Washington as the first president. They created this, served 4-year terms, could serve more than 1 term and stuff like that, and as well. The author of the Constitution was James Madison, a staunch Federalist. He was in charge, one of many in charge of the Federalist Papers. John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison all had a part in the Federalist Papers, whereas Thomas Jefferson was more of an anti-Federalist. So the author of the Constitution was a Federalist. The author of the Declaration of Independence was more of an anti-Federalist. Now, on the very bottom page, 19-year study guide, it says, in order to form a more perfect union, why was this done? This was not to show British government up, saying we're better than you. It was to show that the Articles of Confederation, which was failing miserably, this was a better system of government set up than over the Articles of Confederation. Thus, it was an improvement to improve the union, so to speak. And then you have the purposes and stuff like that. So if you have any of the we the people, the B or C on 7A, B, C, and bottom of 19, understand why that was done. All right. The next thing we have is ratification. And after we do the ratification, after we finish page 20 and 21, we are then going to go over all the different states, regardless of when it was discussed in the semester. I think I've got a long list. I don't know if I have all of them, but I think I have quite a few of them. All right, ratification required 3/4 of the states. With 12 attending, Rhode Island not attending, you needed 9 of the 12. The first state to ratify was, okay, once again, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists there. I've already talked about that. James Madison, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton for Federalists. Strong central government. They wanted James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, an Anti-Federalist, along with the larger states, was respected on the Anti-Federalist stance. Okay. The first state to ratify was Delaware. Delaware would also is going to come back. We're going to talk about Delaware a little bit later on. New Jersey was the 9th state. Why is New Jersey important? I'm sorry, New Hampshire. New Hampshire was the 9th state to ratify. I apologize, 9th state to ratify. So New Hampshire was important as the 9th state, which is what you needed as a majority, then 3/4 of the ratification process. You needed 3/4 of the states to ratify. So even though the Articles of Confederation said you needed unanimous consent, they disregarded that and put up the ratification as 9 states to ratify, New Hampshire being the 9th. Virginia and New York hadn't ratified by then. North Carolina hadn't ratified by then. And then Rhode Island didn't even attend. So eventually New York and Virginia, with 40% of the population, later on ratified. Then we had the Bill of Rights introduced. Bill of Rights, George Mason was the main founder of the Bill of Rights under the Virginia Freedoms that he had created. And then during that, after they've been created, the Bill of Rights had been created, North Carolina ratified the Constitution. Rhode Island never eventually ratified well over a year later, and even the Bill of Rights had been ratified. So understand that all the Bill of Rights had gone into play even before Rhode Island had ratified the Constitution, because they did not attend. So, all right, that is the history portion. From then, the next thing we're going to be going over is the clauses and amendments. But what I want to do now is to go over all the different states that you have, that you had maybe on the exam. If you want to write these down as I do, you may have to backtrack on this recording a little bit. But anyway, the first state I have is Delaware. Delaware was the first state to ratify the U.S. Constitution, and it also is a state that provides uniformity and a direction, a guide towards public corporation laws. So if you had a question in Chapter 10 dealing with corporate laws and uniformity, or how do they look at it, Delaware is a state that does that. Connecticut. Connecticut was the Connecticut Compromise, came from a major delegate of Connecticut. Therefore, the Connecticut Compromise came from that. And then also, Connecticut was the first corporation in the United States. You could incorporate for any legal purpose. Now, the East India Trading Company was the first one overall, but the first corporation in the United States was under Connecticut for any lawful purpose. New Hampshire. New Hampshire was the 9th state to ratify. We just went over that. And then if you're in 211, that is where the Bretton Woods Agreement in your last chapter, chapter 16, occurred in New Hampshire. Alaska, the Exxon Valdez, 1,100 square miles of oil was spilled on the shoreline. Took 14 hours for the first barge for cleanup to exist, leading to the passing of the Oil Pollution Act. New York. New York had 40% of the population. You had New York versus Gitlow. We'll talk about that when we talk about the cases. But that was legal recreational activities. Colorado, North Dakota, and New York were all examples of legal recreational activities under off-duty conduct. Remember that, legal recreational activities. So New York, legal recreational activities. Colorado, legal recreational activities. North Dakota, legal recreational activities. Okay. Virginia, bicameral legislature based upon population under the Virginia Plan. New Jersey wanted a unicameral legislature with equal power for each state, equal representation for each state. You also had the Standard Oil New Jersey case with the Rockefeller case, establishing rule of reason. Took 21 years to get them, but that's the other one. Kansas. Kansas was in Chapter 10, your blue sky laws, not to be confused with blue laws in Chapter 2. Blue sky laws, another name for securities laws from the wheat fields and bumper crops of wheat fields in Kansas. Wyoming was the first LLC on existence. Germany, the first country to use LLCs, but Wyoming was the first LLC. Wisconsin was where the first workman's compensation occurred. Rhode Island was the last state to ratify. North Carolina was the last state that ratified, that attended the Constitution Convention. So you basically have those two questions that could, depending on the wording, one's the correct answer versus the other. Montana requires just cause for firing someone. The just clause under employment and will doctrine is modified to include just cause. Maine, you had the fishing bait was allowed because it had a legitimate state interest. In Oklahoma, the fishing bait was not allowed. They could not show a legitimate state interest. Louisiana is a part of the Fifth Circuit Court. New Orleans is where the Fifth Circuit Court is located. And Mississippi is also a part of the Fifth Circuit as well. The last one, obviously, is Texas. Texas, we have a bunch of different things that you need to know, maybe the elements, the subtle elements in Chapter 5 of the personal intentional torts. But of the main things under Texas that we need to know, one, we're part of the Fifth Circuit Court, okay? You have Texas v. Johnson, Lawrence v. Texas, Hopwood versus TU Law School, all of those cases that involve Texas. We are the first LLP, limited liability partnership, originally for professionals, now can be done by anybody who's originally for professionals, accountants in Texas, and now it's for anybody. We do not use interference with prospective economic advantage. We do not use the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing in Chapter 12 in regards to employment law. And then we do not allow defamation of dead people, meaning you can sue someone for defaming a dead person's reputation. All of those things you might have had on Texas as well. All right, that's the end of this second video. We will be basically starting on page 20, midway through 22, because we've already talked about this part of it. We'll go through all that through the Bill of Rights and everything like that. So the next one will be a little bit longer for Chapter 2 on clauses and amendments. Will be a longer video. Then we've already done the beginning of chapter 3 already with that civil versus criminal chart. So we'll basically go straight into the Texas court system. And we'll talk about a little other chart as well on that. If you have any questions, feel free to text me, email me, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.